afternoon. My topic today is disenfranchised grief, which makes me think of a different name for it, which would be please don't should on me anymore. Because people have shoulds as far as who should be grieving, why you should be grieving, and everything else. And disenfranchised grief, sometimes you feel like people aren't giving you the support that you need. Basically what it's meaning is that it's the type of grief where people are thinking, ugh, she should be over it by now, or, well, really, was it all that much? And I'll give you some instances of this. For instance, let's start with a pet. If a pet dies, and Lord knows that that can be just so traumatic for a family, but other people will think, well, it was your cat, or it was your dog, like, get over it, you know. But meanwhile, I'm still crying when my dog died, 6 months ago, and every so often when I look at her picture, my eyes, well up, and I think, oh, she is such a good girl. Whereas a lot of people would go, couldn't you get over it? I know I've got a friend who, she lost her daughter, and by lost, her daughter has been missing for 15 years. And every birthday, of course, the mom is on and talks about how much she misses Jessie. And also on the date of when she went missing. She was an 18-year-old girl who went down to Las Vegas and was never heard from again. And so quite often people on Facebook, for instance, will say, can't you get over that? Like, you don't know where she is, or she's probably dead. Can't you just sort of quit, holding a candlelight for her sort of thing and hoping that she comes back? I don't know how any mother could just go, oh, okay, well, she hasn't been back for 15 years now, so I guess I'll just say it's done. But it's hard sometimes for that mother to get the support that she needs on those days where she just feels like it just happened. And then as she celebrates her other children, who are adults now, any of their birthdays, of course, she thinks back. Other instances would be, if you've known anyone that's had a miscarriage, or an ectopic pregnancy, something like that, where they had that hope that the pregnancy was going well, and something goes wrong, and you have a miscarriage, and sometimes people think, well, you know what, she was 2 months pregnant. Ugh, what's the big deal? She didn't know the baby or anything else. That's not it. There were hopes and dreams and wishing and feeling that baby in your stomach and everything, and whether or not you really did, but you could feel that you were holding a precious life. And I found this with someone that I know very closely, that she still, every year on the date where she lost the baby, she still is thinking of it. And the baby was only 2 months in utero, so it wasn't like the baby was a 9-month-old or 9-month pregnancy or anything like that. And people, will say, well, you know what, like, it wasn't really a life. Well, that is up to different philosophies, so we won't even go there. But the whole thing is you need to be supportive of the person who is grieving, because everybody grieves differently. Sometimes, whereas we might think, well, like, is she going on and on? Yeah. And that's fine, because everybody is entitled to live the way that they need to get through the grief, to get through the crying, to feel the depth of their pain. And whether or not other people feel it, that's just the way it is. I had an ectopic pregnancy at one point, and probably 6 weeks in is when I found out it was ectopic. And after, when I lost the baby, I felt like a failure. Like, of course, you're a woman and you couldn't even do that, There's so much guilt that you're feeling, like, did I do something wrong? Was there something I should have been doing? And there was basically nothing, I guess, that I could have done, obviously. But the grief that I had of just questioning myself as to, well, every other woman, you know, could have a baby, and you're seeing all of your friends at that point being able to have a child, and you're thinking, what a failure you are. And you're grieving, grieving the loss of that, grieving the loss of the dreams. It's like at the end of a marriage where you're feeling a grief, and whether or not you've been the person who has left, or whether you're the person who was left, everybody's grieving because it's not what you expected it to be. You expected it to be the picket fence, the happy ever after, and then you find out it didn't turn out to be that way. And so you feel like, you know, you're in this midst of this whole big ball of grief, and you can't see your way out of it. And people are going, well, yeah, but you left him, so you should be okay, you know. This is obviously what you wanted. And to me, I find that it's not necessarily like that. You're still grieving the loss of what you expected. There's many other types of grief that people don't necessarily think are, you know, appropriate that you go on. Let's say if it's the loss of a job, or maybe it's the loss of our freedoms that we've had during COVID, where we are sort of feeling like, I've had enough. And you do feel like you're grieving because your life has been taken away from the way that we knew it to be before. And we're all trying to figure out what the new normal is. There's many other things that can cause a disenfranchised grief, or can appear as a disenfranchised grief when people wonder what the heck you're doing and why you're in it for so long. I know with both of my parents, when they died, and they died at separate times, my grief was totally different. My father died instantly from a massive coronary, and we were thinking he was gonna be alive for another 20 years or so. But he was gone. And that grief hit me like a ton of bricks. And of course I felt like, you know, the rest of the world should be grieving because I lost my dad. But of course, the rest of the world isn't feeling that way. But I also felt some peace because I always let my dad know how much I loved him. So it wasn't like I had a bunch of regrets. I didn't have the regret of, gee, I wish I would have let him know. I let him know all the time. When my mom passed, she was in the hospital for 4 months, dying of cancer. And cancer, of course, has a very ugly way of putting people through just terrible, a terrible death, I think, where you see them waning away, and then, you know, they may not be making that much sense because of the morphine or the types of medications that they're on. So you're grieving throughout, I think it was 3 or 4 months that I spent in the hospital with her. So during that, you're grieving. And when it finally happens, your grief is different, or it can be different. I can't say it has to be different because everybody grieves differently. My grief at that point was almost a bit of relief because I hated to see what she had gone through. I knew that she was grieving before she died because her life was so different than what it was. She was a very active person, and here she had been made into a person who, you know, couldn't get out of bed or anything at that point. So there's grief that's going along throughout that process. It might be something like a traumatic event. I've worked with people that have either been on the side of having a murdered family member, or on the other side of things where their child had been the murderer. Both, and we'll talk of that one. The son, who was 18 or 19, had committed murder. It was on the front page of the paper. And the grief that she felt in just, number one, that her son had taken a life. Number two, when she found out what had happened and all the abuse that her son had endured prior to this happening. Also the grief that she felt during the trial, the grief that she felt when she knew her son was doing what was right, which was admitting his guilt and saying that he deserved to be punished, and grieving that her son wasn't going to have that kind of life that he had always dreamed. He was just about to graduate, and of course all of that was ripped away from him. So you feel, whereas I may not have been as understanding, when you're sitting with a friend and you're realizing what they're going through, you understand that the grief that they're feeling is very traumatic for them. And I'm not too sure that they actually ever got over it, to tell you the truth. The son has been out of prison and everything. I've worked with families where their child has been murdered or through overdoses. I've heard people say, well, you know what, he chose his life. No, you don't choose an addiction. It's a sickness, number one, as we all know. But they also don't choose that path in their life where every day they've got to wake up and get the drug and everything else. And so for them to be discounted as parents, that you shouldn't be grieving because, you know, like the guy was a loser or whatever. Well, that was their child. That was a child that they had hopes for and everything else, and I'm sure that the child felt the same way. He had hopes for himself too. He didn't want to end up to be, you know, on fentanyl or whatever the case may be. And people tend to make judgments that they shouldn't be entitled to their grief. Well, I think anyone can be entitled to grief, if regardless what it is. If it's the loss of a job and you really, really enjoy that job and all of a sudden everything's going crazy and they're downsizing and next thing you know, you're the last one to be going, and you feel such an overwhelming sense of grief. You feel guilt, you feel the loss, you feel the pain, the worry that comes with it as well. And a lot of times people don't understand that grief of losing the job is like a major grief. Grief is one of those things which they say is the hardest for people to deal with. It's a very, very stressful time for people. So if they've lost a job, sometimes it might be that they lost a friendship. I know throughout my life, I had always thought that friendships were forever. Not necessarily does that happen. And that was sort of a naive part on my behalf. If I've had a friendship for a long time and then the next thing I know that they're gone, I will grieve it like I grieve a death, it seems, because I counted on that person, or I felt that we were so close, and not to have them in my life again is like basically like a death. And you realize that you've got to reformat sort of your life again. It's similar to when you've lost someone in another way. You have to look at what your life is going to be like without, and whether it's without that person, whether it's without that job, whether it's without that baby that you had so much hope for in your life. But you have to, and I hate saying you have to, because nobody has to do anything, but you want to get through it if you can, and you want to give yourself the time that you need to get better. You want to give yourself just the grace of being able to grieve because you loved someone, or you loved something, and whenever there's love and there's a loss, there's grief, and it's just sort of the way it goes. And it doesn't mean that if this person doesn't grieve as much as that person, well, they didn't love the person as much. That has nothing to do with it. People grieve in totally different ways, and it may be that, you know, for 2 weeks they've held it together perfectly and they've done everything. They've planned the funeral, they've got everything. They phoned everybody that they had to. They did all the paperwork that they had to do. And so it's a rush, 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 rush. And then it all comes to an end after family member has been buried, and then they break down. And sometimes it's at that point where people are going, yeah, but we already went through that with you for 2 weeks, like, nah, let's just get on. That's when you just sort of, your body, everything lets go, and you feel that this immense amount of stress and everything that you've been holding on to, you finally are able to relax it a bit, but now come the tears and the sobs and the loss, the phone calls that you can't make every day. For instance, when my mom died, I was used to talking to her on the phone every day. I grieved not having those phone calls, because I thought we were just phoning each other to say, did you see that on TV? Wasn't that stupid? Or whatever. It wasn't like we were having intellectual conversations. We were having really silly conversations. But I really grieved that. And when I have talked to people after they've lost someone, especially a mother or someone that they had constant contact with, they'll say that's one of the things they miss the most. They miss those phone calls. They miss being able to just pick up the phone anytime and say, so what's happening? What are you guys up to? I'll pop by. There's no more popping by. There's no more of the things that made that relationship really special, and whether it was the silly things you did. Let yourself express the feelings in any way that you can. If there's something that you can do, as in art, drawing, singing, anything where you can express yourself, maybe it's on paper, maybe it's by journaling and saying how you felt this extreme loss, and you can see as you go along throughout time, you can see that it's getting less and less, but it's also where you can laugh more. Maybe you can now start to go, oh, I remember when they used to do so-and-so, and then you laugh with your family and you go, wasn't that great, And those are the kinds of things that you realize you've gotten over the really painful part of the grief. Remember that friends, they try their best. They try to be there for you. Sometimes they don't understand why it's taking so long. I found with myself, one of the things I really disappointed myself with was, and I guess it's because there's, as you're growing up, my mother had 3 miscarriages, 2 which were at the full term, and 1 which was prior to that at about 7 months. And I never actually had thought about it very much. I never thought about why she was the way she was until she passed away. And then I started to think, gee, imagine what that was like. At 9 months, here you are, you're giving birth, and the next thing you know, your baby that you thought was fine and you were taking home and everything is now gone. And I thought, gee, that was pretty cool of me not to have thought to myself, you know what, that makes me understand her much better. But sometimes someone that's very close to us, it makes it even harder for us to understand what they're going through, because we want them to be happy. We want to get them through things, but the only way you can get through things is by going through it. So if you see a friend that's stalled and can't get through everything, seems like they are constantly thinking, of the loss and everything, let them go through that. Just let them know, though, that if they need you, you'll be there. You don't have to discuss it all the time. If they want to discuss it, that's great, because talking about it sometimes helps, and most times it does. But sometimes they don't want to talk. They just want to sit with you. They just want to know that you care and you're there for them. Maybe you want to establish, some sort of every birthday your family gets together or whatever, and you deal with your grief and your things together as a family. I find, actually, for myself, I'm not the type of person that would want to grieve with everybody. I prefer to grieve alone. as if that makes sense, but that's just the way that I am. And quite often, I think that's when you have the best cries too, is when you're by yourself. And it's a healthy thing to let yourself get through that. Don't feel that because others are saying, well, you know, it's really not that big of a thing, that you're wrong. It's just you have a different feeling about things. The other things, I just want to see if there's murders and suicides. Suicides quite often are something that people will say, oh, I don't want to bring that up because it's going to make them think of it. No, they're thinking of it anyways. It's not going to be something that you're all of a sudden pulling out of them and they're going, oh geez, I haven't thought about that. No, they're thinking about it a lot. So if you can be there as a support for someone who's dealing with a suicide, remember they are grieving. It's not something where people just get over, or that they feel, quite often I think they do feel guilty because they wish that they could have done something for the person. So being able to be there for someone and caring for them is the most help that you possibly could be. And sometimes you just see that someone's personality has changed totally since the loss and everything else. And that's just being able to get through it. Sometimes people just put on a stoic kind of face and people are thinking, oh, they're doing great. But you aren't seeing what happens behind the scenes. You aren't seeing when they just lose it on, on themselves. When they're making dinner and all of a sudden everything just seems to be going wrong. We don't need to be telling people, you should be over anything by now. Shoulds don't work. And that's why I say, please don't should on me anymore. Because shoulds are something that other people are telling you to do. Shoulds are things that are usually other people's opinions of how you should be able to deal with something. And we just don't fit into that because we're human. You may have gone through an extreme depression. You may have gone through drinking from it. Whatever the case may be, you're trying to get through the grief, and that's what you have to do, and do it as long as you have to do it to get through it. Do it as short as you do. Don't go by what people are telling you is the right way to do it, because there is no right way. Even if it's Kubler-Ross's way of going through the different steps of death, not necessarily do we go through those steps in that order. Not necessarily do we go through all the steps. We're also very different. It could also be, one of the things I see here is the dementia, and I know when my mother was ill and towards the last part, because of morphine and everything else, she had dementia that had come on from all of the medications and everything. And you feel a big sense of grief then, because you realize when you're talking to that person, they aren't hearing you back the same way, they aren't able to converse with you anymore. And everything can cause us a feeling of grief. Just let yourself go with that. It could be the death of a partner who was abusive to you, that also people don't understand. They'll go, yeah, but he was an idiot. Yeah, he may have been an idiot, but you did care, obviously. You were with the person. Let yourself go through the grief that comes with that as well. Sometimes moving to a new community, and moves can be extremely stressful. So there's so many things that we can end up grieving for, especially nowadays, because we have this huge thing of COVID in front of us, and it's not getting any better. It's not like we're ever going to be without masks, it seems. So I feel like I'm grieving at some points just the loss of the freedom of just going and seeing people and seeing them smile. It's going to be a real thing when I see someone smile again. Because everything has changed. I feel like we've gone through this huge loss. We've gone through a huge lost as far as just being able to see everybody, hug everybody, go to restaurants, live like we don't care, you know, and the grief, you know, a lot of people will go, yeah, but you know, you're healthy, you're right, and I have many, many blessings, and it doesn't mean that I'm not counting my blessings just because I may be grieving some of the things that we've lost during this pandemic. So give yourself permission to do what you need to do to get through it. We're all different. We all grieve totally differently. Some may cry, some may not cry. Don't judge them by that. Just be there for people. Don't judge yourself harshly because you're going through something and you think, geez, you know, nobody else would be grieving. Well, yeah, that's fine. It's you. You're grieving, and that's good. You know, that's okay. So give yourself permission to go through the things that you need to go through. It's part of the thing of being a human. And thank goodness we have those things. Thank you.
Thank you, Jocelyn, and thank you to Cropo Funeral Chapel for hosting this online grief seminar today. Before we end, I just want to remind everyone about Palliative Manitoba's programs and services. We have our telephone bereavement program where we can match you with a trained volunteer to receive weekly phone calls. We also have our Kids Grieve 2 and Teens Grieve 2 online support group that's coming up this spring. And we also have our monthly bereavement message that gets sent out the first of every month. You can sign up for this message on our website at www.palliativemanitoba.ca. Thank you.